Okay, so thank you all for being here. This is our final PCFS seminar of 2023. We do have talks lined up for 2024, so make sure to check out our website for that, www.pocfs.org. Today, however, we are very pleased to be hosting Donal Khosrowi. Donal is a postdoc in philosophy of science at Leibniz University, Hanover in Germany, and his current research focuses are many and wide-ranging, including things like the epistemology and ethics of artificial intelligence, general philosophy of science, focusing on things like models, simulations, and experiments, philosophy of social science, focusing on the role of non-epistemic models and political values, and philosophy of economics, concerning things like causal inference and the extrapolation of causal effects from experimental and quasi-experimental data. Today, however, we're very happy to have him here to tell us about closing the attribution gap, a framework for attributing credit to AI-generated outputs. Donal, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Andre, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and share this work with you. Let me just see if I can get the screen share started. All right. Are you all able to see that title slide? Great,
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so let me start with a little bit of context before I zoom in on the particular project that I want to share with you today. So as I'm assuming you all know, generative AI has taken the world by storm in recent years. So there, as a philosopher of science, but also sort of like a just normal human being, there are two things in particular that sort of stand out for me personally that caught my attention that I've been thinking about also in connection with each other. One is the advances in sort of Gen AI in creative contexts where we have systems like ChatGPT or text-to-image systems like Stable Diffusion or DALL-E 2 that are used for a huge range of purposes, but kind of mainly my interest is in when they're used to generate novel outputs from human prompts. And then in science, we also find generative AI technologies more recently, but also sort of related non-generative AI technologies. I'm not actually still super sure what the difference is, and I think machine learning people aren't either. But anyway, these systems are used for ever larger tasks in science, in sort of novelty-related pursuits, at least in science. So think of discovering protein structures with the help of AlphaFold or new materials and so on, but even things like sort of predicting scientific discoveries and who's likely to make them. So all of that I find hugely interesting, and mainly because across both of these domains, generative AI and related technologies seem to cause significant conceptual disruptions, which means that there are lots of foundational concepts that we use to understand and sort of organize central human pursuits. And these concepts are challenged, either sort of like in applicability or precision, and so on. So here's just some examples from both of these domains. So for instance, in the creative domain, there's a lot of pressure on concepts such as author and creator. So what does it actually mean to be an author and creator, given the affordances of these systems to assist us in producing text or images? Are large language models and text-to-image systems creative in any substantive way, perhaps in ways that don't require a mind? There is another sort of connected, deeper down concept that gets under pressure. And equally in science, we have sort of analogous questions. What does it mean to be a discoverer or researcher? Do generative AI systems have scientific understanding? And lots of other questions about sort of how we should understand the outputs of these systems. Is that sort of just a hypothesis or evidence, or it's a form of expertise and so on. So there's just lots of interesting sort of conceptually disruptive stuff going on across these spaces. Now, these conceptual disruptions, they kind of mainly yield conceptual uncertainty, right? So it's a challenge for sense making on the part of various stakeholders. So if we look at the creative space again, so with the advent of these systems, especially sort of text to image systems, a lot of people had to start asking themselves, so like, what is my role here in making images, right? So I'm clearly not doing the things that I used to do, which was, for instance, to use Photoshop or related software and sort of, craft digital paintings. They're not using virtual brushes anymore. They're using prompts now to steer sort of more from the outside and orchestrate the behaviors of a system that then ultimately is supposed to yield similar outputs, but in a very different way. And so people have been quite inventive about sort of, capturing what sort of novel role they play now, sort of coining that term like prompt engineers and so on. but there's sort of downstream of that also lots of practical, epistemological, ethical, legal, and regulatory uncertainty. So questions like, should we award copyright for AI-generated outputs? Is it okay to use LLMs to write grant applications and papers and so on? So lots of controversy and debate around these sort of more practical questions, of course. Now, I'm sort of currently in the process of building this upcoming project that tries to deal with these conceptual disruptions across both domains in a systematic way, more broadly. But here today, I want to zoom in on one specific disruption, which concerns the notion of creator or creatorship. So this is work based on a recent project that I ran earlier this year together with Finola Finn and Eleanor Clark, called Machine Discovery and Creation. And it's also based on earlier work with Eleanor Clark on AI-assisted scientific discovery. So if you know that paper, you might see how some of the themes sort of resonate between the two. All right, so let me start with an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So this paper focuses mainly on visual Gen AI systems, so text-to-image systems like Stable Diffusion, DALL-E 2, and so on, that generate images from human prompts. Later, I'm also going to expand a bit about recent additions to this project that engage with text production using LLMs. But for now, we're in the visual Gen AI space. So these systems have been highly controversial in the public and academic debate. There's lots of issues around toxicity and the tendencies of these systems to produce harmful contents discussed. There are these large issues about the illegitimate scraping at web scale of training data, and originators of images complaining that, hey, wait a minute, I didn't agree to have my work scraped and systems trained that can recreate my style at zero cost. There's issues of plagiarism where sort of a lot of pressure, I guess, is put on whether these systems can indeed actually produce novel outputs or whether they're sort of quite conservative in near reproducing existing works. There's concerns about fair use and so on. Now, aside from these, I think two issues really stand out in ongoing debates as highly conceptually disruptive. I don't think that these are conceptually disruptive, but here are two. One is about creativity and the notion of art. So these are questions like, are Gen AI outputs genuinely creative? Are they sort of artistically or aesthetically valuable? The sort of, is it art question. There's been lots of debate around this, but we're not engaging with this at all. Rather, we focus on the creatorship question. So this is the question, who made an output? Who's involved in its production in some significant way? And who should be credited for the output? That's what we're going to focus on here. So there's lots of sort of, I guess, options in this space. So you could say, well, I mean, maybe it's just humans are creators, human users are creators, and Gen AI is just a tool, just like any other tool, like Photoshop on steroids, essentially. There's also the option to say that, well, maybe, it could be possible that we can understand Gen AI systems also as creating outputs rather than just, fitting in the role of a tool. And then there's questions about, the roles of other agents, like developers, the producers, originators of training data, maybe even sort of, click workers used for reinforcement learning from human feedback and so on. Now, issues of creatorship are significant for a variety of reasons. So they bear on issues of ownership and control, so who owns an output, who can make money of it, and so on. They connect to issues of responsibility, so who should be held accountable if things go wrong, if outputs are problematic in some important way. And they also bear, again, sort of on people's understanding of their own roles and their changing roles in the production of image outputs. Now, this project starts, I guess, from the observation that the existing views that have been floated, both in the public and the academic debate, seem fairly uncompelling. A lot of them are very sort of all or nothing, and they lack a lot of descriptive and explanatory depth. And this is what we want to improve upon. So what we do in the paper is we propose the CCC view, which stands for collective-centered creation. And in a nutshell, this view says that creatorship of Gen AI outputs is a collective endeavor, and membership of different agents and entities just depends on the nature and the significance of the contributions they make. And in fine-graining this general view, we try to offer a much richer conceptual toolkit that can actually help us understand precisely what these contributions consist in, and sort of how strong the claims to creatorship and the claims to sort of co-creatorship they ground are. Two nice things that I'm going to try and highlight that this framework does for us is it can reinforce some existing intuitions that have been offered in the public and academic debate, as well as generate some interesting new ones. Crucially, I should stress, though, that CCC is not supposed to finally settle specific disputes or solve practical downstream issues, such as how to exactly apportion copyright and so on. It is only meant to inform debates surrounding these issues. All right. Okay, so let me provide a brief overview of three types of views that have been offered in the existing public and academic debate. So they're fairly straightforward. The first is just to say that, well, so human users are the creators and generative AI systems are just a tool. So people in this space argue that Gen AI systems lack things like agency, autonomy, understanding. They don't exhibit any sort of genuine creativity, if at all. It's sort of like accidental. They sort of only follow their programming, and they're lacking sort of essential requirements for what it means to be a creator. So Gen AI is just a tool, like a sophisticated brush or Photoshop. The second view says that Gen AI does create, and humans might very often actually take the backseat in creation. So in this space, people argue that Gen AI can somewhat autonomously create novel imagery, exhibiting at least mindless analogs of things like skill, imagination, and creativity. Oopsie, Photoshop is just tripping this up. All right, there we are. And third, there are collaborative views, which say, well, maybe it's more plausible to think that humans and machines co-create. And this actually resonates with a lot of users in online spaces discussing these questions, and also resonates with sort of co-productionist views in art theory, which have been around for quite a bit longer than generative AI. Now, among these three types of views, we find collaborative views to be the most compelling, but we also find that they say too little on how exactly credit may be distributed. Okay, so let me explain how we build the CCC framework to sort of respond to this situation. So CCC starts from the observation that centrally, this question of who is the creator just seems ill-posed. And CCC insists that for most cases anyway, of creation using generative AI, there is no clear single creator who can be credited with an output. Usually a collective of agents and entities all made important contributions, and credit should be distributed according to the nature and the significance of the specific contributions made. Now, who then are the creators? How much credit are they due? And what features should we look to in apportioning credit? That, of course, are the really tricky questions. So next, I'm going to walk you through 7 different features that the CCC framework uses to clarify creatorship and credit questions. All right, the first feature is what we call relevance and non-redundancy. It's sort of 2 features kind of that come as a package. The question here is basically take X away. So X could be a contributor or a contribution. What would the output of Y have looked like? And the idea is that if the output differed, if you took X away, then clearly X made a difference to that output. And if it didn't differ, then either X just wasn't very relevant in the first place, or X could easily be substituted with something else that then ultimately yields the same output. So here's an example. So consider Jo, who's sort of like a classically trained painter. She's producing these large, beautiful oil paintings, and frequently she recruits a friend, Jake, to hand her some of the brushes, which are sort of in the far side of the room, unfortunately. She likes Jake's company, and it's sort of like, he feels useful and likes to be, have the illusion of being like quite involved in producing these fantastic paintings. But really, Jake doesn't actually make a difference, right? So if he were not around, then Jo would just pick up the brush herself, or she would recruit another friend to fill in for Jake. And there would be no difference at all to the paintings she produces. Now compare that with Jerome, who's also an artist, a friend of Jo's, and they frequently collaborate on pieces. So Jerome might, for instance, make suggestions for composition, or even at the brush level, like, hey, how about we use this brush to achieve that texture over there, and so on. So you can see how Jerome might make a difference, and also how it might be difficult to replace Jerome with someone else to get the same output. So that's relevance and non-redundancy. The idea is that the more relevant and non-redundant, the stronger ceteris paribus the claim to creatorship. Okay, a second feature is what we call control. The question here is, how precisely and robustly did X steer or maintain an output Y to be a certain way rather than other ways? So consider, for instance, Jill, who's an expert user of Stable Diffusion and who has this very clear vision in mind of what image she wants and iteratively refines her prompts to get a specific output. Now compare that with a casual user, Jake, who just prompts cat on a mat, enter, gets the image you see on the right, and he's happy with pretty much any output that roughly conforms to the prompt. So it could have been very much a different picture, but equally, he would have been fine with that. Now, between the two, Jill exerts more control. She has this clear vision in mind. It will keep pushing through iterating her prompts, the system to yield a certain kind of output. And the kind description could be really quite precise and narrow. Whereas Jake has this very coarse-grained prompt and doesn't really steer anything. So he gets something back. He doesn't push back to get something specific. He's just fine with cat on a mat type images. Now note that control is rendered as a causal notion and not an intentional notion. So this is really all about X having causal powers to change or maintain an output Y to be a certain way rather than other ways. In this way, generative AI systems can exert control over outputs. So if Jake gets the image on the right and doesn't push back on it in any meaningful way, then it's the Gen AI system that has control over the output. It makes it a certain way, sort of robustly, rather than other ways, unless Jake intervenes. So you can see how control is this sort of zero-sum notion. Okay, so in summary, control asks, how robust is the output and due to who, right? Who had the sort of capacity to intervene, but maybe chose not to, right? So you can exert control also dispositionally, right? If you're happy with the first output you get, if it is exactly what you wanted, but you had intervened, had it been different, you are also understood as exerting control. Okay. And again, sort of the more control, the stronger the claim to creatorship. The third feature CCC draws on is originality. How original is a contribution and how unique is it to the contributor? So a good starting point to look for originality in this space is to look at user prompts, right? So let's imagine a user who comes up with this brilliant prompt that no one has ever conceived before, a Donald Trump-shaped cheese wheel rolling down a hill. Now compare that with this not very inventive prompt, cute dog, right? So between the two, the first would be a lot more original and perhaps also sort of, unique to the contributor, let's assume. Now, what about Gen AI? So we think that Gen AI systems can also be understood to exhibit originality in the contributions they make. So these systems are built and supposed to learn novel relationships and representations at training and to draw on these at inference when synthesizing images. So for instance, in the cheese wheel case, a collage of three things, sort of Donald Trump over here and a cheese wheel over there and some grassy hill down here would not be enough. It would not conform to the prompt competently. We need some kind of interpolation, sort of like a coherent visual entity that looks like Donald Trump, a cheese wheel, and like it's rolling down the hill. And a system that can render something like that could be assumed to have made some original sort of semantic connections at training between the different concepts and issues, and then also sort of text-image type of connections, and achieve certain representations that then ultimately afford that sort of competent output. Okay. Now, a frequent pushback we get at this stage is to say that, look, but doesn't originality still ultimately come from the user? I mean, after all, it was their idea, right? So think about the genius who came up with a cheese wheel prompt. And to this we say, well, yes, that's true. That's certainly something that we should be prepared to credit, but also we need to distinguish the originality of the what and the how. These are really very different, right? So here the prompt is an original take on what is supposed to be produced, but then there is also this question about, well, how are you going to make it? And there might there are additional originality requirements in figuring out a way to do that. A good case to see that is to take Jake, who has the idea that he would like to see an image that encodes the abstract feeling you get when you realize that you didn't tell your parents that you love them enough. All right. So let's suppose he's the first one to come up with this prompt. Let's say that there are no images in the training data that sort of are anywhere near this. And so he gets an image back, and it's quite striking. I was like, wow, this really looks exactly like that feeling. It encodes that feeling really rather well. So here's a case where the originality of the output doesn't just boil down easily to the originality of Jake's prompt. Jake might have had no idea whatsoever how one could visually encode that feeling, but upon seeing it, he realizes that is a way. And this way was not for him to figure out, it was for the system to sort of figure out, as it were. Okay. Fourth, this is a tricky one. Time and effort asks, how much time and effort did a contribution involve? And the idea is that the higher the share of time and effort, so the share of the total time and effort exerted to produce a certain output, the stronger the claim. So for instance, consider Jake again, who hands Jo the brushes she needs to produce her oil paintings. If he's recruited for 1,000 hours plus, then this is something that we should perhaps recognize, even if that is the only thing that was contributed, right? And I think there is lots of ways of contributing to the production of things that kind of are mainly significant for the time and effort they involved. And this is something that we want to track. So we're saying here, time and effort should be considered, right? However, they are extremely crude and difficult metrics. So there is the problem of inefficiency, for instance. So if you use a lot of time but do it very inefficiently, perhaps that shouldn't count for much. Then there is the question of, well, how do you commensurate the time and effort sort of exerted by humans versus machines? That's also a bit tricky. You need to find some sort of a common currency to cash it out. We have some ideas for that in the paper. But what we're saying here is, these difficulties aside, time and effort should count for something. Even so, we do get a lot of pushback on this, and I just want to reply to that straight away. So first of all, we're not saying that the more time and effort you exert, the better the output, the more of a creator, the more of an artist you are, right? So it's not tracking aesthetic value or anything like that. Second, there are these sort of cases where you have an artistic genius who can furnish a contribution with zero effort, basically, just comes for free to them, versus someone who's pedestrian, who's maybe just as skilled, but really struggles to deploy that skill effectively. And between the two, it seems sort of weird at first blush to say that, the pedestrian is more of a creator, furnishing the same contribution just in virtue of the fact that it took them longer and that it was more sort of effortful for them to make their contribution. But we want to sort of double down here and say, well, I mean, so the genius and the pedestrian might still rank very highly across all kinds of other features, but there is a distinction between them in that the artistic genius shouldn't be credited for what they didn't contribute, which is time and effort, whereas the pedestrian should, to the extent that we think that's important. And then third, again, so this just to stress that time and effort are sort of normalized, right? So it's not that if you artificially inflate how much sort of time and effort you exert during a project, then you are more like 3 times as much as a creator as your friend and get 3 times copyright or whatever downstream benefits. It's normalized to the total time and effort exerted for producing an output. Okay. Leadership, this is a little more straightforward. Response to the question, did a contributor steer an output with a specific intention, directing means to ends and sort of orchestrating things? And you might already see, so to illustrate, let's just look at Jill again, who is a sort of expert user of stable diffusion and combines various means to achieve a certain output. So she uses in-painting techniques, control net, which is sort of ancillary methods to, say, control the pose of a person in an image and the general composition in a much more fine-grained way than just mere prompting does. And she sort of iteratively refines her prompts and so on. So this would be a way of displaying leadership. Again, compare that with Jake's sort of crude cat in a mat attempt. Now, you might already see that leadership involves control to make things a certain rather than other ways, but also it involves intentions. So it involves identifying, setting, and pursuing goals, and orchestrating available means to achieve one's ends. And Gen AI systems trivially cannot display leadership, only control. So this is the distinction. Okay, we're almost done. 6, independence responds to the question, did a contributor depend on detailed guidance or did they act more autonomously? So consider Joe and Jerome again, who each collaborating on this painting independently make suggestions and have a conversation, a sort of like open-ended endeavor of figuring out like what the painting should be like, based on their own aesthetic convictions and so on. Compare that to Jake, who just hands the brushes to Joe specifically as she requests them and entertains sort of no ideas about, is that the right brush for the job and so on. So with Gen AI systems, we think that some independence is possible. So the idea is that within the constraints of a learning task, which is obviously set up by developers, deep neural networks must be sufficiently flexible to learn just whatever there is to learn, sort of whatever sort of text-image relationships and so on are out there. And humans don't fully determine that, right? That's the main point of using a machine learning approach to things, is that, well, we don't want to be the ones to sort of manually tune the weights and biases of a neural network. So the network must be sort of sufficiently flexible to respond to whatever there is in the data, right? And we're sort of uninvolved. And to that extent, these systems can exhibit sort of independence as flexibility. And that's especially true in unsupervised and self-supervised regimes. Okay. Finally, directness asks, how directly is a contribution involved in producing an output? So let's have a look at Joe again, our painter, who unfortunately is pretty cash-strapped and actually lacks like workspace. So she can't paint anymore because her paintings are massive and she needs sort of a big studio for that. But then her wealthy friend Jack steps in and says, look, you can have my studio. I love your work. Please, continue to do whatever it is that you do. Don't need to sort of acknowledge me or pay me anything. That's all fine. So Jack in this example is highly relevant, of course. He makes an all or nothing type difference to whether Joe can produce paintings, but his contributions are not direct. He doesn't change the content of whatever paintings Joe ends up making. And compare that again with Jerome's direct suggestions, like, no, I think we should do that differently over here. I think this shade would be nicer, or it would be, and so on. So for Gen AI systems, the computations that they perform at inference directly generate the output, or sort of could even be understood to constitute the output at issue. So that's how Gen AI systems fare. But sort of more broadly, directness takes a special place among the features that CCC highlights. So it modulates the weight that other features have. So if you look at developers, for instance, they're obviously, in the same way as Jack, highly relevant to a lot of outputs out there, right? So if there hadn't been people around who built systems like Stable Diffusion, then a lot of people wouldn't have been able to produce a lot of images. And they're non-redundant, or at least sort of they used to be non-redundant. They're getting more redundant these days. But what they do is they contribute to Gen AI function, generally speaking, but not directly to any specific outputs, right? So that is the difference. So they're enablers, but not doers, in a nutshell. Okay, now how do all of these 7 features work together? So all of them, as you've probably noticed, are gradual in character. We also think that none of them are necessary in the sense that you need to exhibit a certain amount to be a creator. and none are sufficient by themselves. So you can, exhibit sort of any amount of, any of these features, and it's not going to imply that you're a co-creator. Rather, what we think is going on is something like, well, if you score highly across many of these, that makes you a strong candidate for being a member in a co-creating collective. It doesn't yet settle that question, but it at least indicates that we should take you seriously as playing that role and as deserving of credit. But we also want to stress that there are going to be very different combinations across this feature space that can each license strong claims to co-creatorship. So it's not that there's just one unique way, sort of one profile you need to exhibit. There can be very different profiles reflecting different kinds of roles that are important in producing outputs. Also, we do not insist that these 7 features are ultimately the right ones or the only ones that matter. And there's sort of lots more sort of conceptual work to do to refine them. Because unsurprisingly, some of them sort of overlap and are related to each other in really intricate ways. But we can talk about this more in the Q&A later. Okay, we do think, however, that they are useful starting points to make progress on these creatorship questions in a way that is much more systematic than earlier views afforded. Okay, so let me outline a bit more clearly what this framework can actually do for us in practice. So let's start with the big question that a lot of people seem interested in. So can Gen AI systems actually be part of co-creating collectives? Can they be understood as creators in some relevant sense? And CCC says yes, under certain conditions. And to draw this out, let me just give you 2 examples. So here's Jill using stable diffusion to produce the image on the right. So assume Jill is sort of highly trained and highly skilled digital artist, and she has a clear vision that she wants to produce almost this specific exact image, or at least something within a very well-defined sort of narrow region around it. And she follows this extensive iterative prompting regime, makes some sketches, sort of controls the pose of the cat, and so on. So Jill displays, let's assume, high originality. So she's the first one, let's assume, to have come up with the idea of making an image like this. She's non-redundant to the image. She exerts a lot of fine-grained control, displays leadership, exerts a lot of time and effort in sort of planning and pre-sketching, collecting samples for colors and materials and so on. And stable diffusion, by contrast, displays some relevance. And there's like some time and effort involved in the computations performed at inference. There's some originality. So the point really of using stable diffusion is that it does ultimately fill in some blanks that Jill leaves. And this must draw on original connections made at training. But there is very low control on the part of stable diffusion. It's really Jill who's in the driver's seat. And it's also somewhat redundant because we can assume that Jill is this highly skilled digital artist who could have produced pretty much the same output, give or take, just manually, as it were, using Photoshop or some other comparable software. Let's contrast this with Jake and Midjourney producing the cat on the mat image you see on the right. So he prompts cat and mat, presses enter, Jake's happy. Jake displays low originality. He's fairly redundant, so anyone else could have made the same image. He exerts very little control, if any. So basically steers the system towards looking at a really big region of the latent space and sample from there. Sort of everything that's broadly cat in the mat in character is fair game. He displays also no leadership and exerts very little time and effort. Typing the prompt, hitting enter, that's pretty much it. And compared to Jake, relatively speaking, Midjourney exhibits high relevance in redundancy. So we can assume that Jake wouldn't have been able to produce any image whatsoever without the help of this tool. He's not a competent user of Photoshop or anything. And Midjourney, in fact, is in control of the output. It sets the tone for how the image looks like, and Jake doesn't push back on it. And there's comparatively kind of more time and effort involved in inference than Jake exerts when he types this 5-second prompt and hits enter. So between the two, we think that this shows that Midjourney, in fact, has a stronger claim than Jake to being a creator of the output. So CCC says that under some conditions like these, Gen AI systems can be serious candidates for creatorship. All right, let me draw out sort of two more nice features of this view in the visual Gen AI space. So one is that we think that CCC can nicely reinforce some existing intuitions. And here, one example we're going to look at is this sort of family of concerns around the illegitimate scraping of training data at web scale, and artists being sort of taken aback by that and saying, well, wait a minute, I didn't consent to that. That's not cool. I mean, I posted my stuff on like forums for like a very select group of like-minded people to have a look at and maybe be inspired by, but not for literally anyone to be able to reproduce my works or sort of draw on my styles at zero cost for all kinds of purposes. All right. So let's, in this space, look at Jamal, who is sort of like a fully trained, experienced digital artist and has this unique and acclaimed style. And this style gets appropriated by Stable Diffusion without his consent. And as a consequence, he complains on the grounds that I highlighted. Now, one nice thing that CCC can do is it can underwrite Jamal's complaints in a way that is distinct from fair use type or copyright type or intellectual property type arguments. So on CCC, Jamal can be understood as being a distant co-creator, at least for certain images, namely images in his style. All right. So with regard to these images, Jamal's contributions are highly relevant and non-redundant. So the idea is sort of take away all his collective works from the training data, retrain the system, and you wouldn't get these types of images anymore, or they would look rather different. He exerts control sort of indirectly. So if all of his collective works had a much warmer palette, then also a lot of outputs would have had a warmer palette. There's lots of time and effort and leadership, originality, and independence, of course, going towards sort of producing his works, but of course, no directness, right? All of this happened in the past, perhaps without even knowledge that generative AI would ever be around. So he's hence, at most, a distant co-creator, but nevertheless, sort of, we shouldn't entirely ignore the relevant, non-redundant and roles he plays and the control that he sort of exerts through his works. So as such, sort of playing this role of being a distant co-creator, we think that Jamal may reasonably object to playing that type of role, sort of to play the type of role where he co-creates, but without consent, images on this potentially very large number of prompting endeavors led by people who might not share his values, who might pursue interests and goals that he disagrees with, and so on. So this is an independent way of motivating Jamal's complaints that doesn't rest on sort of intellectual property or fair use type concerns. All right. CCC can also generate some novel intuitions. So one that we want to draw out here is what we call illusions of creatorship. So let's look at Jake again. So Jake may understandably perhaps feel that he made Cat on a Mat, but we think that this feeling can be quite misleading, right? So diffusion-based text-to-image systems start from a sort of quasi-random seed number, and depending on sort of the time of the day or other random factors, you might have gotten any out of this set of 4 pictures or a much larger sort of space of pictures that could have been synthesized from the same sort of region triggered by the prompt. And that is essentially just random chance. So we think that CCC can help dispel such illusions because it draws out that this casual use, where you use these kind of simplistic prompts and don't iterate, is much more like browsing a gallery and picking an image rather than making an image, because it fails to exhibit crucial features like, for instance, control and leadership, autonomy and independence that we think are necessary to secure someone's role as firmly in the space of co-creators. Now, that's a completely fine role to play, of course, but it is different from being a creator. And we think that withholding credit when it's based on illusion is just fine. All right. I'm going to take a quick sip. Now, at this point, you might wonder, what about LLMs, basically, is the question that is on lots of people's minds at this stage, because I guess LLM-based Gen AI technologies also have a much firmer place sort of in the public attention right now than text-to-image systems. Understandably, because there's much broader use case, much larger user bases. So let's engage with that question. So these are kind of more recent additions to this project, yeah, so they start from the observation that LLM-based systems like ChatGPT yield similar disruptions as text-to-image systems do. So, for instance, questions like who created this poem? Right? So, like who's the poet here? Should LLMs be co-credited for text outputs and so on? There's substantial ongoing controversy and uncertainty around issues like these. So just one example is the recent Screenplay Writers Guild of America strike agreement. So there's been a strike that centered, among other things, around the issue of what role generative AI should play in producing screenplays for movies and series in the US context. And writers, perhaps understandably, felt threatened by generative AI because they realized that increasingly they were presented with drafts that were AI generated and were asked to refine these drafts and bring them to production level, which requires, that's the assumption, I guess, just less work and less time. At least that's I guess what the people delivering these outlines or drafts or writing plans thought, which then means that writers would get paid less. Okay, so two outcomes of this agreement post-strike are that Gen AI outputs are now not considered to be literary material. So you can supply a screenplay writer with any amount and any quality of drafting, and it will not make a difference sort of to how much they're going to get paid for their work. And Gen AI systems also don't qualify for authorship, full stop. Okay, so here are sort of concrete recent norms that were furnished as a result of industrial action in response to these disruptions. Now, sort of zooming out a little bit from this case, so what we think is interesting when applying CCC to LLMs is that LLMs have just a much broader range of use cases. So they can be used for creative, professional, academic writing, novels, marketing copy, essays, papers, grants, and so on. For ideation, summarization, synthesis, so just for developing new ideas, and that includes roles in research. For knowledge-related interaction, knowledge retrieval, diagnosis, care, therapy, and so on. Code generation, and the list just goes on and on. And what's important is that across these use cases, existing norms and institutions differ pretty radically, and so will also the conclusions that you can generate by applying CCC. So here, I want to just draw out two cases of how CCC can help refine. So applying CCC to these cases can help refine CCC as a framework, but also draw out some new insights which we think are interesting. So one is that existing norms and institutions are not really apt to capture the nuances of co-creation in the way that CCC highlights it. And second, that creatorship and thicker notions such as author, novelist, programmer, or even artist can come apart quite dramatically. And we think that that's quite interesting. All right, so let me just give sort of two examples. One is from creative writing. So let's look at Jayani, who is an experienced novelist. She's written a bunch of novels, fairly successful, but recently sort of encounters sort of blocks to her productivity, really kind of struggles to come up with a new project, and starts giving ChatGPT a shot. So she uses ChatGPT to create a detailed plan for this novel called Whispers of the Chronosphere, which is actually generated by ChatGPT, if you're suspected that maybe already. And upon seeing the plan, she's fairly impressed, like, oh, that's a pretty interesting sort of themes here pursued here. I kind of really like the relationship between the characters, some of sort of the main events that are sketched out. That sounds really great. And she sort of starts filling in the details of the plan, following it fairly precisely. So, obvious question, who created and should be credited for the final novel? Now, ChatGPT will score in this example fairly highly on things like non-redundancy and originality. So because of her struggles, Gianni couldn't have come up with the plan. And the ideas, let us assume, are in fact original. So they don't just sort of neo-plagiarize, 3 different sort of novels that are already out there, but they're sort of like within a sort of less well-sampled region of the space. Now, ChatGPT also scores highly on control and directness. So Gianni really adopts the plan basically 1-for-1 and sticks to it. And ChatGPT's outputs exert direct control over a lot of large-scale features of the novel. Now, this control is global and not local, but nevertheless, sort of key themes, character outlines and features and backgrounds, the relationships between characters, specific events, and sort of the overall sort of narrative arc, they're all sort of set in ChatGPT's plan. But of course, not specific sentences. This is sort of the downstream task that then Gianni takes on later. So Gianni, in turn, also exerts a lot of control and other things. So she fleshes out the plan, she fills in the gaps, brings the characters to life, adds detail, her own style, and so on. So CCC, we think, suggests that, well, both ChatGPT and Gianni seem to score somewhat highly for co-creatorship, and both should be credited. But then let's consider Gianni. Sort of credited, yes, but for what role exactly? So this is not super clear if you sort of think along the lines of standard ways of identifying who made something, sort of, notions like author. So her role is not that of a traditional author-writer start to finish, right? So think of the associations you have when you see someone's name on a book jacket, right? Ordinarily, things like ghostwriting aside, you will have associations that sort of track them as like, well, this is the person, I guess, who came up with the idea and then developed that idea and then filled in the blanks and then maybe tested that idea and, so on and so forth. But that's not the role that Gianni played. But her role is also not that of just an executor, right? So she's not sort of directed to, all right, and then now write a paragraph on this, now write a paragraph on that. No, go back, all right, okay, this is fine. But she indeed robustly steers the form and the content of the novel, at least at the street level. So here, I think what this example shows is that existing norms, such as the outcomes of the Writers Guild of America strike, carry a risk of over-crediting Gianni, which can undermine or at least severely diffuse the meanings of large-scale concepts like author or writer, which, given the affordances of Gen AI systems, now have to capture, or pressed to capture, a much larger space of possible configurations. So it could very well be the traditional author-writer start to finish, but it could be a case like Gianni's, where it seems that, well, these are really not the same kind of thing. So we think here CCC can sort of step in and just say, well, look, I mean, both need to be credited. And specifically for those things actually contributed, for playing these kind of very different roles, sort of mostly playing out at different levels of sort of generality and abstraction. Okay, just one more example, and then I'll conclude. So essay writing is something that a lot of you might be familiar with as being quite a controversial topic in this space. So let's look at Julius, who is a student studying for a bachelor's degree and uses ChatGPT to produce an essay about climate change and intergenerational justice. Now, importantly, Julius doesn't really know much about either topic and also doesn't really want to. He's pretty strapped for time, like not terribly interested. He just wants credit and ultimately his degree. Now, he uses an extensive and fairly clever sort of prompting regime to get first an overall plan for the essay, and then to sort of further prompt specific passages that then he sort of ultimately weaves together into a somewhat coherent whole. So he's, sort of mainly orchestrating. Now, again, is Julius a creator or author of the essay he hands in? And we think that this is a case where creatorship and thicker notions such as authorship can really come apart quite dramatically. And one way to tease this out is to look at control, the control feature of CCC. So Julius, in this case, might control mainly formal aspects of the essay, such as the overall topic, the length, the tone, the style, and so on, and sort of how the parts, I guess, fit together. But he might fail to control the essay's content, so what's assumed, argued, engaged, referenced, asserted, and so on. So, for instance, the essay might end up making assumptions that Julius is sort of just unaware of because he lacks understanding of the subject matter, might yield implausible corollaries based on these assumptions, might be inconsistent logically, but again, for lack of understanding, Julius might fail to appreciate that, or even incoherent with actually Julius's own substantive views on related issues. So nevertheless, Julius might be a co-creator. So he might make relevant, non-redundant, effortful contributions in prompting ChatGPT that exert control over these kind of formal aspects of the output. But that really seems to be at odds with the kinds of roles that we want Julius to exhibit in this context. So he might still fail to be a co-author of the essay, which he's supposed to be, I think. So thicker notions like authorship insist that we have special relationships with the process and the output. So for instance, that one controls the content rather than just the form, that one understands the outputs and how they came about, that one knows additional things about the output, like what it's based on, what it doesn't engage with, and why, or that one means the things asserted by the output. Now, Julius obviously is a negative case, but it's interesting to consider whether there could be positive cases too, right? So is it sort of useful to consider that one could score fairly low, perhaps in creatorship, but nevertheless be an author? Because there is a sort of division of labor between the making and the maybe asserting and affirming and other sort of the understanding and other important roles that we think sort of come with thicker notions such as authorship. So there's familiar templates, obviously, for this. So think of ghostwriting or of executives or politicians sort of signing off on reports and speeches, which has not much to do with authorship, but sort of captures these other kinds of relationships that we have to text outputs that maybe should take precedence over the making parts. Now, what we think this case suggests is that CCC kind of helps us open up this space for conceptual negotiation and refinement between sort of the kind of more between, I guess, thinner concepts like creatorship and thicker concepts such as authorship, which involves all kinds of sort of extra ingredients. Okay, let me briefly wrap up with some conclusions. Okay, so creatorship with generative AI systems is usually, anyway, collective in nature, and we feel that there is an important need to capture this and capture it well. We've offered the CCC view, the collective-centered creation view, which offers a finer-grained conceptual machinery for addressing these creatorship questions and larger conceptual disruptions in a systematic way. And some benefits of this view are that it can help push back against a lot of sort of unfortunate things that happen in the public and academic discourse. So things like fairly simplistic narratives, like people saying, oh, Gen AI is clearly a creator, or no, it's all about developers, and they built these systems, they deserve all the credit, or well, it's all in the training data, there's nothing new going on here, it's just like all theft and reproduction, all of which we think ignore important nuances. It also pushes back against brittle analogies, like people saying, like, look, this is just, old wine, new caskets. Like, we've been there before. Cameras, Photoshop, we've seen all these debates, and they all played out in that sort of way. It's just another tool. And we think that these responses just fail to recognize distinctive features of Gen AI, like forms of originality and independence, for instance. And finally, CCC can also sort of push back against problematic sort of framings, such as developers sort of insisting also in communication with regulators that, oh, this is a powerful tool. So, and then sort of, I guess if undesirable outcomes come about, that's probably you should look at the users, right? So there's like a lot that hinges downstream on what types of framings we use to understand our roles and sort of relationships with these technologies. And we should be sort of, I guess, cautious about sort of the downstream sort of consequences that come with these different framings. And we think that CCC can sort of help us draw this out quite nicely. So overall, then there is substantial scope and an important need to reconceive basic concepts that capture and organize our roles and our relationships with Gen AI in these central human pursuits. So I've talked about the creative business, but you can probably already see how this also translates into other novelty pursuits in science. And we think that a framework like CCC doesn't have to be exactly the way that we spell it out here, but a framework like CCC can be a really useful engine to facilitate this process. All right, thank you for your attention. If you're interested in reading our discovery paper, you find a link on the left, and the creatorship paper, this one is on the right in an early form. Thanks.